Hello, my name is Kevin Paprick, and I am going to go through a demonstration of taking an existing NetApp HCI cluster, where I have a 2-compute node cluster with 4 storage nodes that are NetApp HCI based, and we'll add generic compute into this that has the same look and feel as those NetApp compute nodes would have been scaled through NDE. Looking at the environment, we have that single data center and we have a single cluster in here today. Looking at our VDS setup, we are using a 2-cable VDS with 2 uplinks here, and it's named NetApp HCI VDS01. The prerequisites to begin is you do have an ESXi host with ESX installed, the management IP setup, as well as the root password. And you also have to go into this variables file that you would bring in to edit the variables as per your environment. I'll now move over to the automation piece, where this is going to be leveraging a Docker container that's running powercli along with the SolidFire PowerShell modules. I have now kicked off this script, and the first step is to connect to or verify connections into vCenter and SolidFire. So I will look at this and see if I already have an existing connections in place, so I'll press no, and we can see there I am already connected. If I did hit yes here, it would be asking me for the login credentials for both the SolidFire cluster as well as vCenter. The next step is to create new vCenter objects. Do you need to create a new data center? We're always going to be creating a new cluster, but also do you want to integrate into the existing NetApp HCI VDS or create a new one? With step 2 started, we see the variables that are going to be used, just as a confirmation in case we need to edit the variable file and come back in. It's now asking if that data center already exists. Does this cluster already exist? So now through automation, we just added that new cluster into vCenter that has similar settings to what you get with a NetApp HCI cluster installed through the NetApp deployment engine. So now asking if we want to create a new VDS. We do not. We're going to leverage the existing NetApp HCI VDS. Now that we're done here, we now can add that ESXi host to the cluster. We are not adding this as part of step 2. That would be if you're using a generic vCenter that you created that new VDS switch to look like NetApp HCI. But in this environment, we are scaling an existing NetApp HCI cluster. It's now going to ask for some verification around the fully qualified domain name and get those root credentials to be put in to be able to access into this host. At this point, the host is now added into vCenter, and it's now going to configure those uplinks. These uplink numbers are going to be specific to each compute node, so you would want to verify these. And it's also now verifying the management port group, the iSCSI port groups, as well as vMotion that are going to be integrated for this new host into that NetApp HCI VDS switch. As I already had the IP addresses in place and in the variables file, I was able to just click to continue. As the last 2 steps, this then enabled iSCSI on this new compute node, as well as setting up the port binding to bind those 2 physical ports that are used as uplinks into our iSCSI configuration. Now that we are done with this, the last step what we want to do is add that SolidFire connection. This step will now go through a number of SolidFire steps where it will first create a new account with the same name as the compute cluster we added. It will then create data stores based off of volumes on SolidFire. So it will make those connections to SolidFire, create the volumes, add them to an access group, and then create the data stores on VMware. Before that begins, we do have to integrate the IP of our SVIP for SolidFire into vCenter. That will also all be handled automatically through this portion of the script. If I wanted to manually change the number of data stores, I could change this here or change the QoS. Instead, I will just leave it as is and continue. This is now complete, and we'll go over to vCenter to look at all of the steps that have been done through automation. Within vCenter, we now see the new NetApp HCI cluster 02 that was set up. We also see the new ESXi host, this generic compute node that we added into our NetApp HCI environment. Looking at the configuration here, we can see that iSCSI was set up with the iSCSI server as well as the network port bindings. Going over to data stores, we can see that it has the local data store, but it has also created this NetApp HCI cluster data store that was done through automation and is backed by our NetApp HCI or NetApp SolidFire storage. Looking back at this compute node and looking at the networks, we can go to the distributed switches and see that it has been added to that NetApp VDS switch. And going back to the compute node that we just added, looking at the VM kernel adapters, we can see that we created the VM kernel adapters that match that of the existing compute nodes in NetApp HCI, as well as migrating them to the NetApp HCI VDS switch. Clicking over to an existing compute node, you can see that similar setup and look and feel. So what we just showed here is that ability to add a third-party or generic compute node into an existing NetApp HCI cluster through automation. The next question one might ask is, well, did this break my usage of the plugin? The plugin is so easy to use to create new data stores. So I'll just go through the workflow showing that we can still use this plugin to create additional data stores on that generic compute node that we added, even though we did it all through automation. As we scroll down here, we can actually see this new cluster or new data store that we added. I now need to pick which host I want to set this to, and I will have this set up to any host that's within my new compute cluster that I just set up. I will configure a new volume, 1 terabyte in size, and set it up to my gold policy. We can now see this new data store that we just created through the workflow shows up in the element management plugin, and going back to the host and cluster, we can see that data store showing up on our new host that we added through automation. As a recap, through automation, we were able to maintain that consistent NetApp HCI-like look and feel, having the same networking and same settings for a new compute cluster within VMware with generic compute nodes. This was all done through automation, giving you that consistent setup and having the same easy scale solution for these generic compute nodes.